We're now well into the thick of Bernie Sanders' second run for the presidency, but I've already noticed that many of the sorts of patterns that we got used to in 2016 in terms of the relationship between the campaign, the media, the coverage, and of course the reception from elites inside of the Democratic establishment, very similar to the last go-round. Joining us now to talk about all that and more, Brianna Joy Gray, National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign. Welcome back to the show.
It's my pleasure.
Glad to have you here. So, I mentioned in that intro the media, so I'd like to start there. How would you rate? Previously in 2016, you were more of an observer to the campaign. Now, you're right in the thick of it. The media's approach to Bernie Sanders as a candidate and his candidacy, how would you rate it in comparison to 2016?
I mean, look, I was less than an observer. I was a civilian, just an attorney. And I became a writer in part because of how frustrated I was because of the media narratives that didn't really connect to my experience or the experiences of millions of Americans. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of the same retread of what happened in 2016. Now, things are different insofar as that Bernie Sanders is a front runner and he's a lot more difficult to ignore than he was last time. This time, at least, somebody carried news of his announcement. But of course, we are seeing some repeated trends, like an emphasis on the most unfavorable polls, which are kind of polluted by poor sample sizing, sampling older voters, sampling people who aren't likely caucus goers, et cetera, and generally misrepresenting the enthusiasm that's on the ground, including last weekend in Iowa.
Well, and interestingly, just to expand on that a little bit, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there was an analysis put together that showed that depending on how Bernie polled, the likelihood, the worse he polled in a poll, the more likely there were to be a large number of articles written about it. Like the ones where he did best had almost no press coverage, but when he dropped down a few points, suddenly you had dozens of articles being written about it.
Right, that's the case with polls, like electoral polls. It was also the case with respect to polls showing his popularity among certain demographic groups. Polls that support a narrative that Bernie Sanders isn't as favored among, brown and black Americans. Are much more popular than polls that shows overwhelming favorability. I remember right before I left The Intercept, there was an article published that showed that Bernie Sanders was outperforming Kamala Harris 2-1 with black voters, and a lot of candidates, including Pete Buttigieg, are continuing to poll in 0 to 1 digits, while Bernie Sanders has consistently remained the second most popular candidate with African Americans and the #1 most popular candidate with Hispanics. However, there are nary a headline to be seen about that. But if that poll were to slip, I have no doubts that we would hear a lot about how Bernie Sanders has a black voter problem.
For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.